I just finished 3.5 months in Northwestern Zambia at Mukinge Mission Hospital. I was relieving a missionary surgeon there by the name of Dr. David Friend, who went back to Australia to care for his brother who was very, very sick and subsequently passed away just 6 days before I left. I've been to Mukinge many times in the past, and I love the people. I love the staff. I love the missionaries. They consider me a part of their family, and I consider them a part of my family. Most of my days were spent making rounds on the male and female and pediatric surgical services and seeing patients in the clinic twice a week, teaching the many nursing students that are there at Mukinge. And I was scheduled to operate 4 days a week, but often that stretched to 7 days a week because of the numerous and constant emergencies that we saw there. Many times I would have some little ones who would want to help me on my rounds every morning. We took care of many patients who had burns and snake bites and all sorts of trauma. This visit, there was just a lot of trauma, a lot of infections and cancers and hernias and all the general surgical things that I generally do. This time I operated on a lot of people with goiters, did thyroid operations for people with goiters, and I found that these are some of the most grateful patients that you ever take care of, because often they've been suffering for years with this massive mass in their neck, and it's difficult for them to swallow or breathe, and they're so relieved when this is operated on and removed. And many times they would come back years later just to say thanks. This lady I did 7 years ago at Chitokoloki Mission Hospital, she made her way back to Mukinge just to say thanks. And this is a sweet lady, very sweet lady that I did last year. She found out that I was back at Mukinge, and she made her way back to the clinic just to say thanks for what we had done. You know, Joel is very well known in Zambia. So many of the staff would get up early in the morning, 6:30 in the morning, watch the broadcast from this very place right here at this pulpit. And then they would report to me in devotions what Joel had preached on, and then secondly, how he had made fun of me during the message. And this is a true fact. Many people are now naming their children after Joel. Unfortunately, they just don't know how to spell that last name correctly. So it warmed my heart immensely to meet people that still remember my dad and still read his books and still listen to his tapes. We were very busy, and I underline the word very because most of the time I was the only surgeon at the hospital, and for a few days, I was the only doctor at the hospital, and when I finished, I counted the numbers, and all told, we saw 775 patients in the clinic, 500 patients were admitted to the surgical service, and did 461 operations in 3 months, so amen. One of the things I always try to do is I try to bring supplies and equipment to give to the hospital because they're always lacking. I always bring several $1,000s worth of sutures so I don't deplete their limited supplies. But this year, God put it in my heart, really, I specifically wanted to take some instruments, surgical instruments that they needed. Specifically, I wanted to take some 7¼ DeBakey forceps and some Cooley clamps for vascular surgeries. Both of those instruments are named after the prominent Houston surgeons, cardiac surgeons. And then I needed some fine right angle clamps that I use for the delicate part of a thyroid operation, and then some Haney clamps for hysterectomies. These are very expensive instruments. So Jen and I would go on eBay and we would look and try to buy used instruments that really were not very good quality. About 2 weeks before I left, Joyce Kayla from the missions department called me and said a gentleman wanted to donate some instruments to me. And I'm always a little cautious when people want to give me something because I'm not really sure what I'm going to get. But I said, send me a picture. And when he sent me a picture, I saw this box of really, really good surgical instruments. And so I was excited. I said, yes, absolutely. I'd love to take those instruments. But rather than him just to send the box to me, he said he wanted to personally give me the box. So one morning, Mr. Bill Moore and his lovely wife, Mary Sue, and his daughter, Patty, they came up to my office. Mr. Moore began to tell me that for 40 years, he had designed instruments for V. Mueller, one of the premier surgical instrument companies in the world. And he also went on to tell me that for 40 years, he had worked designing instruments for Drs. Michael DeBakey and Dr. Denton Cooley, and he had helped design the very instruments that I wanted to take with me to Zambia this year. He told me that he had, for 20 years, he had gathered instruments, and he had kept these instruments in his garage for 20 years, and he felt like God had prompted him to give me those instruments. The only stipulations were two. Number one, he wanted to make sure that they would be used by surgeons who would preach the gospel to their patients. And secondly, Mr. Moore insisted that he get no credit or recognition or praise for what he had done. Mr. Moore then proceeded to give me not one box, but 15 boxes of the finest surgical instruments that you can buy, including the very ones that I wanted to take with me. The total value of his gift was probably $150,000 conservatively. And if I didn't say before, he gave me 15 boxes, not one box of instruments. And I was able to not take just a few instruments that I bought on eBay to Zambia with me this year. I was able to bring dozens of instruments with me, and I still have 13 boxes left right here to distribute in the future. Mr. Moore allowed me to share these pictures with you and share the story with you. And he said he didn't want any credit or praise, but he did allow us to say thanks. He and his wife and his son came last night. Watch this video. He doesn't want any credit, but he is here tonight, and he will allow me to say thanks. So Mr. Moore and his son Matt and Ms. Moore, would you stand up and let Lakewood say thank you for your gift. One story stands out this visit. John is a little 4-year-old from a village that's 2 hours from Mukinge. He was brought in by his mother urgently because he had pulled a pan of hot oil on himself, and he had sustained third-degree burns, full-thickness burns, all the way through his skin and subcutaneous tissue to his muscle, on his face, his neck, his chest, his arm, all the way around this arm, and on his leg. And burns are very common in Africa, and in Zambia. There are no specialty burn units. There are no special dressings to use. There's no nutritional support for these patients. And very often, if patients survive the resuscitative time of the resuscitation from their burn, the first 1 or 2 days, they'll go ahead and die 1 or 2 weeks later because of infection or sepsis. I sent John's picture to the main burn specialist in the capital city, and he told me that John's mortality would be 100%, meaning 0% chance of survival at most hospitals in Africa, including the one where he worked. But the team at Mukinge just rallied around John. We embraced him and his mother with compassion and kindness. We didn't have the latest and greatest instruments to use, but we used what we had with excellence and with diligence. We probably took him to the operating room 20 times, and before we started every surgery, we said a simple prayer: God, please spare John's life. For the first 2 weeks, we took him to the operating room and did dressings changes every other day, and surprisingly, he didn't develop any signs of infection. And then we cleaned him back in the operating room and debrided his wounds to get them ready for grafting. And again, amazingly, there was no sign of infection. And then we grafted his arm and his hand, and the grafts took and the grafts healed. And then we grafted his face, and these healed. And finally, we were able to graft his neck and his chest and his leg. And again, the grafts healed with no signs of infection. And then 6 weeks later, against all odds, because the gracious hand of God was on him and the tireless work of the team in Mukinge, little John got on a bus with bus fare that you paid for, and he and his mom and his grandma made their way back to his home village where he'll live a long and a healthy life. You know, I was reflecting one afternoon at Mukinge when I had a brief time there alone, and I reflected on the fact that I'd watched so many poor people flood through the open doors of the hospital that day for help. I reflected on the fact that Mr. Fumpa had worked all morning operating on cataracts. In Africa, the older men and women with cataracts are often completely blind, and they're led into the operating room. And then the next day, when their bandages are removed, they would often weep because their sight was restored. I watched as Dr. Muntali, orthopedic surgeon from Lusaka who came once a month to Mukinge, had just finished operating on dozens of people there, correcting broken and congenitally deformed limbs so people could walk again. I reflected on the fact that Mr. Kapai and his team of chaplains made sure every person who came to the hospital were encouraged and prayed for, and the good news about Jesus shared with them. And then I had this thought: what is happening at Mukinge Mission Hospital pleases the heart of Jesus. The poor are welcome, the blind see, the lame walk, the sick are cared for, and the good news of the kingdom is shared with every person. And here's what I wanted to say this morning. And we at Lakewood get to be a part of what God is doing there at Mukinge Hospital. If John and his mother were here with us today, or if the other hundreds of people that you touched over the last 3.5 months were here with us today, they would say, with a smile on their face and a tear in their eye, "Toi Santa Moani, Lakewood." Thank you, Lakewood. Toi Santa Moani for caring, Toi Santa Moani for coming, and Toi Santa Moani for helping. Friends, they will never forget what you've done. Jesus will never forget what you've done, and God gets all the credit. God bless.